I hope that everybody followed Rousseau's advice and yesterday exercised your rights as citizens of a free state. I hope so. Good. I begin today with an apology, and that is for the particular edition that you're using for this section of the class on Rousseau. This is the only edition that I've assigned in the course that I don't like. Why did I assign it? Because I want us to read the second discourse, the discourse on inequality, and the social contract. And this is the only edition that I could find where they are both in the same volume, and I don't have to assign two separate books. So in order to keep your costs down, I bit the bullet and assigned a translation and an edition I don't particularly care for. A far superior edition is found in this is one of the two volumes, the Cambridge Blue Book series, as it's called, edited and translated by Gurevich. If anybody wants to do more advanced work in Rousseau, you will no doubt get this edition, better translations, better notes, and so on, of the second discourse and the social contract. And for anybody who's interested, I've decided, because Rousseau has become so important to me, that next year I will be offering an undergraduate seminar entirely devoted to Rousseau. He's one of the handful of writers, of political philosophers, to whom one could, in all justice, devote an entire semester to his writings. And that's what I want to do next year. So if any of you should get the bug, the Rousseau bug, next year we'll do Rousseau in many more texts in detail. So with that having been said, I want to talk today about a remarkable human being and writer. It's a very common way of entering the thought of Rousseau to see him as a critic of liberalism, of the kind of property-owning, rights-based society given expression by John Locke. And I will talk about that a little bit later. But to see Rousseau as a critic of Lockean liberalism would be, I think, very short-sighted and very unfair. Rousseau was a product not of liberal society, but rather of the Ancien regime, the old regime in France. Rousseau was born in 1712. It was 2 years before the death of the famous Sun King, Louis XIV, the man who symbolized the age of absolutism. And he died in 1778, approximately a decade before the outbreak of the French Revolution. His life, in other words, was lived entirely within the waning decades, the waning years of the age of absolutism in France and in continental Europe. Rousseau was deeply aware that he lived in an age of transition. But what precisely would come after, he was by no means clear. He wrote, as you will see, with a passion and the intensity of someone who fully expected to be instrumental in the coming of a new historical and political epoch. And indeed he was. Rousseau was Swiss. He was not French. He was a Swiss. He signed many of his most important words simply citoyen de Genève, a citizen of Geneva, after the city where he was born. He was the son of an artisan who abandoned his family after a falling out with the local authorities. And the young Rousseau was apprenticed to an engraver. But he left Geneva, he fled Geneva for good at the age of 16. For the following 16 years, Rousseau lived a kind of vagabond, varied life, doing many different things, working as a music instructor and a transcriber. He was the secretary to the French ambassador in the city of Venice, and he was also the lover of a wealthy woman many years his senior. After moving to Paris in 1744, Rousseau spent several years eking out a living sort of on the margins of the Parisian literary scene until 1750, when he published his first, although quite brief, major essay, a work called The Discourse on the Arts and the Sciences, which catapulted him to literary fame. That work made his name. It came to be called the First Discourse. That work was followed 5 years later, in 1755, by the work we will be reading starting today, The Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, often simply called the Second Discourse. And that work was followed later on in 1762 with The Social Contract, and also the same year that Rousseau published his major, massive work on political education called Émile, or on education, both in 1762. During this period, Rousseau fathered 5 children. He abandoned all of them to an orphanage. He did so with a common law wife with whom he lived. And during this time, the writings I've mentioned are only a small portion, although a very important portion of the writings which he lived. He was also the author of a very large novel, Heloise, the Nouvelle Heloise, which was a bestseller in his time, and it was a kind of philosophical novel that explored many of his ideas. He was the composer of an opera, Le Devin de Village, that was performed at the court of Louis XV. And he also wrote several very important and interesting volumes of autobiography, the best known of which is simply called Confessions, after the work of St. Augustine, a title book of the same name. And he also wrote another volume of autobiography in a dialogue form called Rousseau, Juge de Jean-Jacques, in which he divides himself up into 2 different people, Rousseau and Jean-Jacques, and a kind of internal interrogation of himself. Rousseau wrote in many and varied genres, and his work spans the entire gamut of philosophical, literary, and political themes. He was also the writer of different constitutional projects. He was consulted by heads of state in his period and wrote constitutions for Poland and for the small island country of Corsica, which he said in the Social Contract was the only place in Europe that one might expect great things. And of course he was right. As anybody knows, a generation or 2 later, the famous Corsican, yes? Who put an end? Who am I talking about? Napoleon, of course. You might say he was right. He helped to substitute the general's will for the general will. But that was Rousseau. People have been very baffled by exactly the nature of Rousseau's contributions. What did he believe? What did he stand for? What do his writings represent? Was he a revolutionary whose work helped to inspire the radical phases of the French Revolution? Just remember, for example, you've probably all heard the famous opening sentence of the Social Contract, "Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains." His appeal to the severe political ethics of ancient Sparta and Rome, as well as his belief that the people The people in their collective capacity are the only legitimate source of sovereignty. All of these seem to pave the way for the revolutionary politics of the late 18th century and up into our own time. So was Rousseau a kind of incendiary and revolutionary? Or did his writings seek to release us altogether from the bonds of society, as he appears to do in the second discourse, and the discourse on inequality? In this work, Rousseau seems to lay the basis for the kind of romantic individualism that would be associated with people like Wordsworth in England or Henry David Thoreau in America. Rousseau's direct appeals to nature, as well as his celebration of the simplicity of peasant life and rural life, seem to open the door later on to writers like Tolstoy, as well as to various kinds of social experiments in rural communal utopianism, such as, for example, the Israeli kibbutz movement, which is in its own way a direct descendant of Rousseau. So my suggestion is Rousseau's writings are varied and his influence has been manifold, to say the least. He both helps to bring to fruition and completion the political and intellectual movement that we know as the Enlightenment. He brings this to its highest phase of perfection in many ways, and at the same time he was a severe critic of the Enlightenment. He was a close friend and associate of men like Diderot, who was the general editor of the Encyclopedia, the great